The hell he did! Whole gallon? Yes, sir! Jesus, we had fun. They let the N-word come in, and that night, little Skinner, name of Smitty, took after the N. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the N got him. If he would've used his feet, Smitty says he would've killed the N. The guy said an account of the N got a crooked back. Smitty can't use his feet. He paused in relish of the memory. After that, the guys went on to Soledad and raised hell. I didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more. Lenny was just finishing his bed. The wooden latch raised again, and the door opened. A little stocky man stood and opened the door. He wore blue jeans, trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt. On each side of the square steel buckle on his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him and then scuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers within his knuckles as he went. "Them guys just come?" he said, and shuffled past the boss and out the door. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. "I wrote Murray and Reedy, and I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips?" George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. "It wasn't Murray and Reedy's fault. Says right here on the slip that you was to be here for work this morning." George looked down at his feet. "Bus driver give us a bum steer," he said. "He had to walk 10 miles. Says he was here when he wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning." The boss squinted his eyes. "Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to get out now till after dinner." He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lenny, and Lenny nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. "What's your name?" "George Milton." "And what's yours?" George said his name's Lenny Small. The names were entered into the book. "Let's see, this is the 20th, noon, the 20th. He closed the book. "Where you guys been working?" "Up round weed," said George. "You too, Lenny?" "Yeah, him too," said George. The boss painted a playful finger at Lenny. "He ain't much of a talker, ain't he?" "No, he ain't, but he's sure hell of a good worker, strong as a bull." Lenny smiled to himself. "Strong as a bull," he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, "Listen, Small." Lenny raised his head. "What can you do?" In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. "He can do anything you tell him," said George. "He's a good Skinner. He can wrestle grain bags, drive a cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try." The boss turned on George. "Then why don't you let him answer? What are you trying to put over?" George broke in loudly. "Oh, I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't. But I say he's a goddamn worker. He can put up 400-pound bale." The boss deliberately put a little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted, one eye nearly closed. "Say, what you sellin'?" "Huh?" I said, "What stake you got in this guy? You ain't his pay away from him." "You taking his pay away from him?" "No, of course I ain't. You think I'm selling him out?" "Well, I never seen one guy take as much trouble for another guy. I just like to know what your interest is." George said, "He's my cousin." I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all right, just ain't bright, but he can do anything you tell him. The boss turned half away. Well, God knows he don't need any brains to buck barley bags, but you don't try putting nothing over, Milton. I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit on weed? Job was done, said George promptly. What kind of job? He was digging a cesspool. All right, but don't try to put anything over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I've seen wise guys before. Come on out with the grain teams for dinner. They're picking up barley at the thrashing machine. Go out with the Slim's team. Slim? Yeah, big, tall Skinner. Y'all see him at dinner. He turned abruptly and went to the door, but before he went, he turned and looked for a long moment at the two men. When the sound of his footsteps had died, George turned on Lenny. So you wasn't gonna say a word? You was gonna leave your big flapper shut and leave me to do the talking? Damn near lost us the job. Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget, and I got to talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we got to be careful and not make no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George, what you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? I'm sorry. Be a damn good thing if he was, said George viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. Well, that was a lie, and I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door, and peered out. Say, what the hell you doing listening? The old man came down slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself, and licked his gizzled, moth-eaten coat. Thus Swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing in the shade a minute, scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out the wash house. You was poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't let nobody get nosy. I don't like nobody getting nosy. The old man looked uneasy from George to Lenny and then back. I just came here, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was saying. I ain't interested in nothing you was saying. The guy on the ranch didn't never listen nor don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the Swamper's defense. Come on in and sit down a minute. Sit down a minute. What the hell's... That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall. He rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like your boss? He asked. Pretty good. Seemed all right. He's a nice fella, the Swamper agreed. You've got to take him right. At that moment, a young man came into the bunkhouse. A thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore a high-heeled boot. Soon seen my old man? He asked. The Swamper said. He was just here a minute ago, Curly. Went over there to cook house, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new men, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows, and his hands closed his fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You new guys the old man was waiting for? We just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. Uh-oh. George said, suppose he won't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. By Christ, he gotta talk when he's spoken to. What the hell you getting into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking hopelessly to George for instruction. And you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoken to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. George watched him out, and then he turned back to the swamper. Say, what the hell has he got on the shoulder? Lenny didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight, and he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George. He don't have to take after Lenny. Lenny didn't do anything to him. What's he got against Lenny? The swamper considered. Well, tell you what. Curly's like a little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys, kind of like he's mad at him because he ain't a big guy. You've seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy? Sure, said George. I seen plenty of tough little guys, but this Curly better not make no mistakes about Lenny. Lenny ain't handy, but this Curly punk is gonna get hurt if he messes around with Lenny. Well, Curly's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curly jumps a big guy on licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick somebody his own size, and maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lenny. Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't want no rules. Lenny don't know no rules. Wow. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some of the cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down on another box. Don't tell Curly I said none of this. He'd slow me. He just don't give a damn. Won't ever get canned 'cause his old man's the boss. George cut the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it down on a pile. He said, this guy Curly sounds like a son of a bitch to me. I don't like mean little guys. Seems to me like he's worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple weeks ago. Life lives over in the boss's house. Wow. Wife lives over on the boss's house. Seems like Curly is cockier ever since he got married. George grunted. Maybe he's showing off his wife. The swamper warmed to his gossip. You seen that glove on his left hand? Yeah, I seen it. Well, that glove's full of Vaseline.